Chapter 21. It is said that the Sabbath is a well-fed boy at rest on God's knees. With him rest the waters, birds refrain from building their nests, and men do not work. They dress, ornament themselves, and go to the synagogue to watch the rabbi unroll the holy scroll with its law of God written in red and black letters, and to hear the learned search every word, every syllable, and discover with great art the will of God. It is the Sabbath today. At this very moment the faithful are leaving the synagogue of Nazareth, their eyes still dazzled by the visions which Simeon, the old rabbi, called up before them. The light in their eyes is so strong they all stumble like blind men. They disperse throughout the village, square, and promenade slowly under the tall date palms to recover their equilibrium. Today the rabbi had let the scriptures fall open according to chance. They opened to the prophet Nahum. He placed his finger again according to chance, and it fell upon the following sacred text. Behold, upon the mountain are heard the feet of him who brings good tidings. The old rabbi read these words, reread them, worked up steam. It's the Messiah, he screamed. He's coming. Look around you, look within you. The signs of his coming are everywhere. Within us, wrath, shame, hope, and the cry, we've had enough. And outside, look. Satan sits on the throne of the universe. He holds and caresses man's rotten body on one knee, on the other man's prostituted soul. The years which the prophets prophesied have come, and it is God who speaks through the mouths of the prophets. Open the scriptures. What do they say? When Israel is hurled from its throne and our holy soil is trodden by barbarian feet, the end of the world will have come. And what more do the scriptures say? The last king will be dissolute, unlawful, aesthetic, atheistic. His children will be unworthy, and the crown will slip from Israel's head. The dissolute and unlawful king came, Herod. I saw him with my own eyes when he called me to Jericho to heal him. I took along my secret herbs. I knew all about such lore, and went. I went, and from that day on I have not been able to eat meat, for I saw his putrescent flesh. I have not been able to drink wine, for I saw his blood filled with worms. I have retained his stench in my nostrils for over 30 years. He died. His carcass rotted. His sons came, trivial, unworthy dregs. The royal crown slid from their heads. The prophecies, therefore, have been fulfilled. The end of the world is here. A voice resounded by the Jordan. He's coming. A voice resounds within us. He's coming. Today I opened the scriptures and the letters drew together and cried, He's coming. I've grown old. My eyes are dim. My teeth have fallen out. My knees grown slack. I rejoice. I rejoice because God gave me his word. Simeon, he said, you shall not die before you see the Messiah. Thus, the nearer I come to death, the nearer to us comes the Messiah. Courage, my children. There is no slavery, no Satan, there are no Romans. There is only the Messiah, and he is coming. Men, strap on your arms. This is war. Women, light the lamps. The bridegroom arrives. We do not know the hour or exact moment. It may be today. It may be tomorrow. Keep the vigil. I hear the stones of the nearby mountains shift under his feet. He's coming. Go out, perhaps you will see him. The people went out and dispersed under the tall date palms. The rabbi's words were extremely disorganized, and his auditors struggled to forget them completely, so that the roaring flames would subside and their souls could once more dispose themselves around cares still at hand. And while they promenaded, anxiously awaiting the hour of noon, when they could return to their homes, and by talking, arguing, and eating forget the sacred words, look, there with his torn clothes, barefooted, his face a flash of lightning, was the Son of Mary. The 4 disciples flocked timidly behind him, and bringing up the rear, dark-eyed and unsociable, was Judas the Redbeard. The burghers were astonished. Where did this riffraff come from? And was that not the Son of Mary in the lead? Look how he walks. He puts out his arms and flaps them like wings. God has swelled his head, and he's trying to fly. He's mounting a rock and gesturing. He's going to speak. Let's go and amuse ourselves. Jesus had indeed stepped onto a rock in the middle of the square. Laughing, the people gathered around, glad that his clairvoyant had appeared. Now they would be able to forget the rabbi's grave words. This is war, he had told them. Keep the vigil. He's coming. He had been booming this hymn into their ears for years and years, and they were sick of it. Now, thank God, the Son of Mary would help them relieve their minds. Jesus waved his arms, signaling them all to gather around him. The place filled with beards, skullcaps, and striped robes. Some of the crowd were munching dates to deceive their hunger, others sunflowers, and the oldest and most God-fearing were telling long chaplets with beads made of tiny knots of blue cloth, each containing a text from the Holy Scriptures. Jesus' eyes flashed. Though he was in front of such a great multitude, his heart felt no fear. He parted his lips. "Brothers," he shouted, "open your ears, open your hearts. Near the words I shall speak, Isaiah cried. The Spirit of the Lord has flowed over me. He chose me to bring good tidings to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom to the slaves and light to the blind. The prophesied day has come, brothers. The God of Israel has sent me to bring the good tidings. He anointed me out in the Judean desert, and from there I come. He entrusted me with the great secret. I received it and came across plains and mountains. Didn't you hear my footsteps upon the hills? I ran here to the village of my birth to announce the happy news for the first time." What happy news? The kingdom of heaven has come. An old man with a double hump like a camel's lifted his chaplet and cackled. "Vague words, the words you speak, son of the carpenter. Vague, groundless words. Kingdom of heaven, justice, freedom, and grab what you can, boys. It's all for the taking. I've had enough. Miracles, miracles. I want you to do something here and now. Perform some miracles to make us believe in you. Otherwise, shut up. Everything is a miracle, old man, Jesus replied. What further miracles do you want? Look below you. Even the humblest blade of grass has its guardian angel who stands by and helps it to grow. Look above you. What a miracle is the star-filled sky. And if you close your eyes, old man, what a miracle the world within us. What a star-filled sky is our heart. They heard him astonished, one turning to the next. Isn't this the son of Mary? How does he talk with such authority? It's a devil speaking through his mouth. Where are his brothers to tie him up so he won't bite anyone? He's opened his mouth again. Shh! The day of the Lord has come, brothers. Are you ready? You have few hours left. Call the poor and portion out your belongings. What do you care about the goods of this earth? The fire is coming to burn them up. Before the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of fire. On the day of the Lord, the stones of the houses of the rich will stand up and crush the inhabitants. The pieces of the gold in the coffers of the rich will exude sweat, and over the prosperous will flow the sweat and blood of the poor. The heavens will open, flood and fire will pour down, and the new ark will float above the flames. I hold the keys, and I open the ark and select. My brothers of Nazareth, I begin with you. You are the first I invite. Come, enter. The flames of God have already begun to descend. Boo! Boo! The Son of Mary has come to save us, hooted the crowd amid fits of laughter. Several people bent down, filled their hands with stones, and waited. A running figure appeared at the edge of the square. It was Philip the shepherd. He had made a dash as soon as he heard of his friend's arrival. His eyes were swollen and inflamed as from much weeping, and his cheeks had sunk away. The very day he said goodbye to Jesus and the companions by the lake, and laughingly called to them, I'm not coming. I have sheep. Where can I leave them? Bandits had rushed down from Lebanon and seized him, leaving him nothing but his shepherd's staff. He kept it still and went from village to village, mountain to mountain, an unthroned king, still seeking his flock. He cursed and threatened, sharpened a wide dagger, and said that he was going to journey to Lebanon. But at night, when he was all alone, he wept. He ran now to join his old friends and tell them about his suffering, so that all of them could set out together for Lebanon. He heard the laughing and booing. What's going on over there? He murmured. Why are they laughing? He came closer. Jesus had now grown furious. What are you laughing at? He shouted. Why are you gathering stones to strike the Son of Man? Why do you brag about your houses and olive groves and vineyards? Ashes! Ashes! And your sons and daughters? Ashes! And the flames, the great bandits will rush down from the mountains to seize your sheep. What bandits? What sheep? Grumbled Philip, who was listening, with his chin resting on his staff. What are these flames he's bringing us now? While Jesus spoke, more and more of the soil-colored people of the slums arrived. They had heard of the appearance of a new prophet for the poor and had run. It was said that in one hand beheld heavenly fire to burn up the rich, and in the other a pair of scales for portioning out their goods to the poor. He was a new Moses, the brighter of a new, juster law. The people stood and listened to him, enthralled. It had come. It had come. The kingdom of the poor had come. But as Jesus again parted his lips to speak, 4 arms fell upon him, seized him, and brought him down from the rock. A thick rope was quickly wrapped around him. Jesus turned and saw the sons of Joseph, his own brothers, Simon the lame, and Jacob the devout. "Go on home, inside. You're possessed with devils," they screamed, rapidly dragging him along. "I have no home. Release me. This is my home. These are my brothers," cried Jesus, and he pointed to the crowd. "Go home! Go home!" The burghers also shouted, laughing. One of them lifted his arm and slung the stone he was holding. It grazed Jesus' forehead. The first drop of blood flowed. The old man with the double hump screeched, "Death! Death! He's a sorcerer! He's casting spells over us! He's calling the fire to come and roast us! And it will come! Death! Death!" was heard on every side. Peter raced forward. "Shame on all of you," he cried. "What has he done to you? He's innocent." A young stalwart flew at him. "It looks as if you're on his side, eh?" He grabbed him by his Adam's apple. "No, no, I'm not!" screamed Peter, fighting to unfasten the huge hand from his throat. The other 3 of Jesus' companions were scared out of their wits. Jacob and Andrew stood by, taking stock of their forces. John's eyes filled with tears, but Judas opened a way through the crowd with his arms, pulled the 2 frenzied brothers away from the rabbi, and undid the rope. "Away!" he shouted at them, "or you'll have to deal with me. Off with you!" "Go to your own town if you want to give orders," screeched Simon the lame. "I give orders wherever my fists are, short-leg." He turned to the 4 disciples. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, denying him already? Forward! Form a circle around him so that no one can touch him." The 4 were ashamed. The paupers and ragamuffins jumped forward, shouting, "Brothers, we're on your side. Let's martyr them." "And I'm with you too," cried a wild voice. Philip flourished his staff and pushed aside the crowd in order to pass through. "I'm coming too." "Welcome, Philip," the Redbeard answered him. "Come, join us, the poor and the wronged, all together." When the burghers saw these slum dwellers rebelling against them, they flew into a frenzy. The son of the carpenter has come to put ideas into the heads of the poor, to turn the established order of the world upside down. Didn't he say he was bringing a new law? Death! Death! They flared up and charged, some with staffs, some with knives, some with stones. The old ones remained on the side and shrieked encouragement. Jesus' friends made their bulwark behind the plane trees at the edges of the square. Others rushed out into the open. Jesus himself went forward and stood between the 2 opposing camps. He spread his arms and shouted, "Brothers! Brothers!" But no one listened to him. The stones were now being slung with fury, and the first of the wounded were already groaning. A woman flew out from a narrow street. A purple kerchief was wrapped tightly around her face, covering all but half of her mouth and her large black eyes, which were submerged in tears. "For God's sake, don't kill him," she cried in her high voice. "Mary, his mother," people murmured. But how could the old men pity the mother at this point? They had become rabid. "Death! Death!" they howled. "He's come to awaken the people, to incite a rebellion, to divide our goods among the barefooted rabble. Death!" The opponents had now come to grips. Joseph's 2 sons rolled on the ground, howling. Jacob had seized a stone and cracked open their heads. Judas stood with drawn dagger in front of Jesus, allowing no one to approach. Philip remembered his sheep. Unable to restrain himself any longer, he blindly swung his staff at his opponents' heads. "In God's name," Mary's voice was again heard. "He's sick. He's gone out of his senses. Have pity on him." But her cry was drowned in the uproar. Judas had now seized the strongest of the stalwarts, and was stepping on him, his knife at his throat. But Jesus arrived in time to pull back the Redbeard's arm. "Judas, my brother," he cried, "no blood, no blood!" "What then? Water?" shouted the Redbeard, enraged. "Have you forgotten that you hold an axe? The hour has come!" Even Peter had grown ferocious, incited by the blows he received. He grasped a huge heavy stone and fell upon the old man. Mary entered the very center of the brawl and approached her son. She took his hand. "My child," she said, "what has happened to you? How did you descend to this? Return home to wash, change your clothes, and put on your sandals. You've made yourself all dirty, my son." "I have no home," he said. "I have no mother." "Who are you?" The mother began to weep. Digging her nails into her cheeks, she spoke no more. Peter slung his stone. It crushed the foot of the old man with the double hump. The victim bellowed with pain and hobbled away, going through the alleyways toward the rabbi's house. But at that moment the rabbi appeared panting. He had heard the uproar and had jumped up from his table, where, with face buried in the Holy Scriptures, he had been toiling to extract God's will from the words and syllables. But when he heard the tumult, he took up his crozier and ran to see what was happening. He had encountered several of the wounded along the way and learned everything. He now pushed aside the crowd and reached the Son of Mary. "What is all this, Jesus?" he said severely. "Is this you, the bearer of love? Is this the kind of love you bring? Aren't you ashamed?" He turned to the crowd. "My children, return to your homes. This is my nephew. He's sick, unfortunate man. He's been sick for years. Do not bear any malice against him for what he has said, but forgive him. It is not he who speaks, but someone else who uses his mouth." "God!" Jesus exclaimed. "You keep quiet," the rabbi snapped, and he touched him reprovingly with his crozier. He turned once more to the crowd. "Leave him alone, my children. Bear no grudge against him, for he knows not what he says. All rich and poor, we are all seeds of Abraham. Do not quarrel amongst yourselves. It's noontime. Return to your homes. I shall cure this unfortunate man." He turned to Mary. "Mary, go home. We'll come presently." The mother threw a final glance at her son, a glance of great longing, as though she were saying goodbye to him forever. She sighed, bit her kerchief, and disappeared into the narrow lanes. While the people were murdering each other, clouds had covered the heavens, rain was preparing to fall and refresh the earth. A wind rose, the stems of the last leaves of the plain and fig trees separated from their branches, and the leaves scattered over the ground. The square had emptied. Jesus turned to Philip and held out his hand. "Philip, my brother, welcome." "I'm glad to see you, Rabbi," the other replied, squeezing Jesus' hand and surrendering his crook to him. "Take this to lean on," he said. "Come, fellow partisans," said Jesus, "let us go. Shake the dust from your feet. Farewell, Nazareth. I'll keep you company until the edge of the village so that no one will bother you," the old rabbi said. He took Jesus' hand and they went in the lead together. The rabbi felt Jesus' palm burning in his grasp. "My son," he said, "do not take the cares of others upon yourself. They will devour you. I have no cares of my own, Father. Let those of others devour me." They reached the end of Nazareth. The orchards came into view, and beyond the fields. The disciples, in back, had stopped for a moment to wash their wounds in a spring. With them were a good number of the paupers and cripples, plus 2 blind men, all chattering and waiting for the new prophet to perform his miracles. They were excited and merry, as though returning from a great battle. But the 4 disciples marched along in silence. Uneasy, they were hurrying to approach the rabbi, so that he could comfort them. Nazareth, the Master's home, had hooted and banished them. The great campaign had started off badly. And if we're chased out of Cana too, they were thinking, and out of Capernaum, and everywhere else around the lake of Gennesaret, what will become of us? Where will we go? To whom will we proclaim the word of God? Since the people of Israel refuse us and hoot us, to whom shall we turn? To the infidels? They looked at Jesus, but no one opened his mouth to speak. Jesus saw the fear in their eyes, however, and took Peter's hand. "Peter, man of little faith," he said, "a black beast with bristling hair sits shriveled up and trembling inside the pupils of your eyes. It is fear, Peter, fear. Are you afraid?" "When I'm far from you, Rabbi, yes, I am afraid. That's why I've come close. That's why all of us have come close. Speak to us and steady our hearts." Jesus smiled. "When I bend far down into my soul," he said, "I don't know how and why the truth always issues from within me in the form of a parable. So, friends, once more I shall speak to you in parables. A great nobleman once commanded a rich dinner to be made ready in his palace for his son's marriage. As soon as the bulls were slain and the table set, he sent his servants to announce to those who were invited, "Everything is ready. If it so pleases you, come to the wedding." But each of the invited found a pretext for not coming. "I bought a field which I must go to see," said one. "I'm newly married myself and can't come," said the next. "I purchased 5 pairs of oxen, and I'm off to try them out," the next gave his excuse. The servants returned and said to their master, "None of the invited is able to come. They all say they're busy." The nobleman became angry. "Run quickly to the squares and crossroads, gather together the people, lame, blind, and deformed, and bring them here. I invited my friends, but they refused. I shall therefore fill my house with the uninvited, so that they may eat, drink, and rejoice at the wedding of my son." Jesus stopped. He had begun calmly, but the more he spoke, the more he thought of the Nazarenes and Jews, and wrath flamed up between his eyes. The disciples looked at him with surprise. Who are the invited? Who the uninvited? What marriage is it? "Forgive us, Rabbi, but we don't understand," said Peter, scratching his thick head in despair. "You will understand," said Jesus, "when I summon the invited to enter the ark, and they refuse because they say they have fields, vineyards, and wives, and because their eyes, ears, lips, nostrils, and hands are 5 pairs of oxen, which are tilling what? The bottomless pit." He sighed. Looking at the companions, he felt completely forsaken. "I speak," he murmured, "but to whom? To the air? I am the only one who listens. When shall the desert grow ears in order to hear me?" "Forgive us, Rabbi," Peter repeated, "but our minds are clods of mud. Have patience. They will blossom." Jesus turned and looked at the rabbi, but the old man was staring at the ground. He had a foreboding of the terrible hidden meaning, and his aged, lashless eyes were brimming with tears. At the end of Nazareth, in front of a wooden shed, stood the customs officer who collected the duties. Matthew was his name. All the merchants who entered or left the village had to pay tax to the Romans. He was short, stout, jaundiced, his hands yellow and soft, his fingers inky, nails black. He had long hairy ears and a high voice like a eunuch's. The whole village found him disgusting and hated him. No one would shake his hands with him, and everyone who passed by the shed looked the other way. Did not the Scriptures say, "It is our duty to pay tax only to God, not to men"? This man was a publican, a tax collector, in the tyrant's service. He trampled the law, made a living from illegality. The air around him was polluted for 7 miles. "Move quickly, lads," Peter said. "Hold your breath. Turn away your faces." But Jesus stopped. Matthew, standing outside the shed, was holding his quill pen between his teeth. He breathed rapidly, not knowing what to do. He was afraid to stay where he was, yet he did not want to go inside the shed. For ages now he had longed for a close view of the new prophet who proclaimed that all men were brothers. Wasn't it he who one day said, "God loves the sinner who repents more than he who never sinned"? And another day, hadn't he said, "I come to the world not for the righteous, but for the sinners. It is with them I like to speak and eat"? And another day, when he was asked, "Rabbi, what is the name of the true God?" he answered, "Love." For many a day and night now, Matthew had turned these words over and over in his heart, saying with a sigh, "When shall I see him? When shall I fall at his feet?" And now there he was in front of him, yet Matthew was ashamed to lift his eyes to look at him. He stood motionless, head bowed, and waited. What was he waiting for? The prophet would go away now, and he would lose him forever. Jesus took a step forward toward him and said, "Matthew." So quietly and sweetly that the publican felt his heart melt, and raised his eyes. Jesus was standing in front of him, looking at him. His regard was tender and all-powerful. It descended to the officer's very bowels, brought peace to his heart and enlightenment to his mind. His vital organs had been shivering, but now the sun fell over them and warmed them. What joy this was! What certainty! What friendship! Was the world then so simple and salvation so easy? Matthew went inside, closed his ledgers, put a blank one under his arm, wedged his bronze inkwell into his belt, and placed his quill behind his ear. Next he removed a key from his belt, locked the shed, and tossed the key into a garden. As soon as he finished, he approached Jesus with trembling knees. He stopped. Should he go forward or not? Would the teacher offer him his hand? He raised his eyes and looked at Jesus as if imploring him to have pity. Jesus smiled at him and offered his hand. "Welcome, Matthew. Come with me." The disciples felt troubled and stepped to one side. The old rabbi bent over to Jesus' ear. "My child," he said, "a publican. It's a great sin. You must listen to the law." "Father," Jesus replied, "I listen to my own heart." They had advanced beyond Nazareth. Passing the orchards, they reached the fields. A cold wind was blowing. Mount Hermon gleamed in the distance, sprinkled with the first snow. The rabbi took Jesus' hand once more. He wanted to talk to him before they separated. But what could he say? Where should he begin? Jesus claimed that in the Judean desert God entrusted him with the fire in one hand and the seed in the other. He said he would burn up this world and then plant a new world. The rabbi regarded him stealthily. Should he believe him? Did not the scriptures say that God's elect would be despised and rejected by men? Like a withered tree which has sprouted among stones. It was possible, therefore, possible that this man was the one. The rabbi leaned against Jesus. "Who are you?" he asked softly, so that the others should not hear. "You've been with me such a long time, Uncle Simeon, from the hour of my birth, and you still haven't recognized me." The old man's heart stood still. "It's more than my mind can hold," he murmured. "More than it can hold." "And your heart, Uncle Simeon?" "My child, I do not listen to my heart. It leads one to the abyss." "To God's abyss, to salvation," said Jesus, looking sympathetically at the old man. And in a moment, "Father, don't you remember the dream the prophet Daniel had about the race of Israel one night in Babylon? The Ancient of Days was sitting on his throne, his clothes white as snow, the hair of his head like the white fleece of a ram. His throne was made of flames, and a river of flames flowed at his feet. The judges were enthroned to his left and right. Then the heavens opened up, and upon the clouds descended who? Do you remember, Father?" "The Son of Man," answered the old rabbi, who had been nourishing himself on this dream for generations. There were even nights when he dreamed the same dream himself. "And who is the Son of Man, Father?" The old rabbi's knees gave way. He looked at the youth, terrified. "Who?" he whispered, hanging on Jesus' lips. "Who?" "I," Jesus replied tranquilly. And he placed his hand on the old man's head, as if blessing him. The old rabbi wanted to speak, but could not open his mouth. "Farewell, Father," said Jesus, holding out his hand. "You must be a happy man, Simeon, for God kept his word and deemed you worthy of seeing, before your death, what you longed to see all your life." The rabbi stood and gazed at him with protruding eyes. What was all this around him? Thrones, wings, and the Son of Man upon the clouds. Was he dreaming? Was this the prophet Daniel? Were the doors of the future opening before him and enabling him to look in? He was not standing on soil, but on clouds. And this young man, who held out his hand and smiled, was not the Son of Mary. He was the Son of Man. Feeling dizzy, he drove his crosier into the ground and propped himself up on it so that he would not fail. Then he looked at Jesus, who, holding his shepherd's staff, was passing under the autumn trees. The heavens had darkened. The rain could no longer hold itself in the sky. It fell. The old rabbi's clothes became drenched and stuck to his body. Water ran down from his hair. Though shivering, he remained motionless in the middle of the road. Jesus, followed by his companions, had already disappeared behind the trees, but as the old rabbi stood in the wind and the rain, he saw them, ragged and barefooted, still going forward and mounting. Where were they going? In which direction? Would these barefooted, illiterate ragamuffins set fire to the world? The designs of the Lord are a great abyss. Adonai, he whispered. Adonai. And his tears began to flow. Chapter 22. Rome sits upon the nations with her all-powerful, insatiable arms spread wide and receives the boats, caravans, gods, and produce of all the world and all the sea. While believing in no God, she fearlessly and with ironic condescension receives all gods into her courts, from faraway, fire-worshipping Persia, Mithras, the sun-faced son of Ahura Mazda, mounted on the sacred bull, which is soon to die, from the many-uddered land of the Nile, Isis, who in springtime, upon the blossoming fields, seeks the 14 pieces of her husband and brother Osiris, whom Typhon dismembered. From Syria, amid heart-rending lamentations, exquisite Adonis, from Phrygia, stretched out on a bier and covered with faded violets. Attis, from shameless Phoenicia. Astarte, of the 1,000 husbands, all of the gods and devils of Asia and Africa. And from Greece, white-topped Olympus and black Hades. She receives all the gods. She has opened roads, freed the sea of pirates and the land of bandits, brought peace and order to the world. Above her is no one, not even God. Under her, everyone, gods and men. All are citizens and slaves of Rome. Time and space are richly illuminated scrolls rolled up in her fist. I am eternal, she vaunts, caressing the two-headed eagle which, having folded its blood-stained wings, reposes at the feet of its mistress. What splendor, what irremovable joy to be omnipotent and immortal, thinks Rome. And a wide, fat smile flows over her fleshy, rouged face. Contented, she smiles and forgets. For whom has she opened up the roots of land and sea? For whom has she toiled for so many ages to bring safety and peace to the world? This never even crosses her mind. She conquered, made laws, became rich, stretched herself over the entire universe. For whom? For whom? For the barefooted man who at this moment, followed by a swarm of ragamuffins, is proceeding along the deserted road from Nazareth to Cana. He has nowhere to sleep, nothing to wear or eat. All his larders, horses, and rich silks are still in heaven, but they have begun to descend. Holding his shepherd's staff, he marches with bloody feet amid dust and stones. Sometimes he halts, leans on the staff, and without speaking sweeps his eyes along the mountains and then above the peaks to a light. God, who sits on high and keeps watch over men, he raises his staff, salutes him, and then resumes his journey. They finally reached Cana. At the well outside the village, a pale young woman with swelling womb was happily drawing water and filling her jug. They recognized her. It was the girl whose marriage they had gone to in the summer. They had expressed their wish at the time that she might have a son. "Our wish has been fulfilled," Jesus said to her, smiling. She blushed and asked if they were thirsty. They were not, so she put the jug on her head, went into the village, and disappeared. Peter took the lead and began to knock at all the doors, running from threshold to threshold. A mysterious drunkenness had swept him away. Dancing, he shouted, "Open up! Open up!" The doors opened, and women appeared. Night was falling. The farmers were returning from their fields. "What's up, friend?" they asked, surprised. "Why are you pounding on the doors?" "The day of the Lord has come," Peter answered. "The deluge. Men, we carry the new ark. All believers, enter. Behold, the Master holds the key. Step lively now." The women became frightened. The men approached Jesus, who was sitting on a rock now and inscribing crosses and stars in the soil with his staff. The sick and the lame from the whole village gathered around him. "Rabbi, touch us so that we may be healed. Say a kind word to make us forget that we are blind, crippled, and leprous." A tall, aristocratic old lady, dressed all in black, cried, "I had a son, and they crucified him. Raise him from the dead." Who was this noble old woman? The astonished farmers turned. No one from their village had been crucified. They looked to see where the voice came from, but the old lady had disappeared into the twilight. Bowed over the soil, Jesus inscribed crosses and stars and listened to the trumpet of war which was descending the hill opposite. Heavy, rhythmic marching was heard, and suddenly bronze shields and helmets flashed in the light of the evening sun. The villagers turned their faces, grew dark. The confounded hunter is returning from the chase. He's gone out again to catch rebels. He brought his paralyzed daughter to our village to be cured, so he says, by the pure air. But the God of Israel keeps a ledger and records and does not forgive. The soil of Cana shall bury her. Don't shout, wretches, here he is." 3 horsemen passed before them. In the middle was Rufus, the centurion of Nazareth. Spurring his mount, he approached the crowd of peasants. "Why have you assembled?" he shouted, lifting his whip. "Disperse!" His face was afflicted. In several months' time he had grown old. His hair was turning gray. He had been broken by his pangs of grief for his only daughter, who one morning had suddenly found herself paralyzed in her bed. As he charged and dispersed the villagers, he glimpsed Jesus sitting off to one side on a stone. Suddenly his face lighted up. He spurred his horse and approached him. "Son of the carpenter," he said, "you have come from Judea. Welcome. I've been looking for you." He turned to the villagers. "I have something to say to him. Go away." He saw the disciples and paupers who had followed him from Nazareth, recognized several, and frowned. "Son of the carpenter," he said, "you have helped crucify others. Take care you don't get crucified yourself. Do not touch the people. Do not put ideas in their heads. My hand is heavy, and Rome is immortal." Jesus smiled. He knew very well that Rome was not immortal, but he did not speak. The grumbling farmers had dispersed. They stood off at a distance and stared at the 3 rebels. A tall old man with a forked beard and his 2 sons, who had been captured by the legionaries and were now being transported, loaded in chains. All 3, with heads held high, gazed over the Roman helmets, trying to see the crowd. But they saw nothing, nothing except the God of Israel, erect in the air and angry. Judas recognized them. He had once fought side by side with them. He nodded, but they, blinded by God's splendor, did not see him. "Son of the carpenter," said the centurion, bending low while still mounted on his horse, "there are gods who hate and kill us, others who do not deign to look down and see us, still others who are well disposed and exceedingly merciful, and who heal the sickness of unfortunate mortals. Son of the carpenter, to which of these categories does your God belong?" "There is one God," Jesus answered. "Do not blaspheme, centurion." Rufus shook his head. "I don't intend to enter into a theological discussion with you," he said. "I detest the Jews, and if you don't mind my saying so, all of you harp on God incessantly. The only thing I wanted to ask you was this. Can your God—" He stopped. He was ashamed to condescend to ask a favor of a Jew. But straightway a narrow, virginal bed arose in his mind, and lying upon it, motionless, the pale body of a young girl with 2 large green eyes, which looked at him, and implored him. He swallowed his pride and leaned even farther over on his saddle. "Son of the carpenter, can your God heal the sick?" He looked agonizingly at Jesus. "Can he?" he asked again, seeing Jesus silent. Jesus slowly rose from the rock where he was sitting and approached the rider. "The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Such is the law of my God." "Unjust!" shouted the centurion with a shudder. "No, just," Jesus contradicted him. "Father and son are of the same root. Together they rise to heaven, together they descend to hell. If you strike one, both are wounded. If one makes a mistake, both are punished. You, centurion, hunt and kill us, and the God of Israel strikes down your daughter with paralysis." "Son of the carpenter, those are heavy words. I happened once to hear you speak in Nazareth, and your words then seemed sweeter than what would be suitable for a Roman. But now, then the kingdom of heaven was talking. Now the end of the world. Since the day you heard me, centurion, the just judge seated himself on his throne, opened his ledgers, and called for justice, who came, sword in hand, and stood next to him. Is yours, then, one more God who goes no further than justice? Shouted the exasperated centurion. Is that where he stops? What then was the new message of love you proclaimed last summer in Galilee? My daughter doesn't need God's justice. She needs his love. I seek a God who surpasses justice and who can heal my child. That's why I've moved every stone in Israel to find you. Love, do you hear? Love, not justice. Merciless, loveless centurion of Rome, who puts these words into your savage mouth. Suffering and my love for my child, I seek a God who will cure my child, so that I may believe in him. Blessed are those who believe in God without requiring miracles. Yes, blessed, but I am a hard man and not easily convinced. I saw many gods in Rome. We've got thousands locked up in cages, and I've had enough of them. Where is your daughter? Here. She's in the garden at the highest point in the village. Let us go. The centurion braced himself and jumped off his horse. He and Jesus marched in front. Behind them, at a distance, came the disciples, and farther back still, the crowd of peasants. At that instant, Thomas, rapturously happy, emerged from behind the legion's rear guard. He had been going behind the soldiers, selling them his wares at an immense profit. "Hey, Thomas," the disciples shouted at him, "you're still not coming with us, eh? Now you'll see the miracle and believe." "I've got to see first," Thomas answered, "and to touch." "Touch what, you shrewd merchant?" "The truth." "Does truth have a body?" "What's this you're piping, blockhead?" "If it has no body, what do I want with it?" said Thomas, laughing. "I need to touch things. I don't trust my eyes or my ears. I trust my hands." They reached the highest part of the village and entered a cheery, whitewashed house. A girl of about 12 years of age was lying on a bed, her two large green eyes open. When she saw her father, her face lighted up. Her soul shook violently, trying to lift the paralyzed body, but in vain, and the joy on her face went out. Leaning over, Jesus took the girl's hand. All his strength assembled in his palm, all his strength and love and mercy. Without speaking, he pinned his eyes onto the two green eyes and felt his soul flow impetuously from the tips of his fingers into the girl's body. She looked at him ardently, her lips just parted, and smiled. The disciples tiptoed into the room, with Thomas first and foremost, his sack of wares over his back and his horn under his belt. The peasants scattered throughout the garden and narrow lane. Everyone was holding his breath and waiting. The centurion, leaning against the wall, watched his daughter and struggled to hide his anguish. Little by little, the girl's cheeks began to redden. Her chest swelled. She was permeated by a sweet tingling which passed from her hand to her heart, and from her heart to the very soles of her feet. Her entrails rustled and stirred like the leaves of a poplar caught in a gentle breeze. Jesus felt the girl's hand beat like a heart and return to life in his grasp. Only then did he open his mouth and speak. "Rise, my daughter," he gently commanded. The girl moved peacefully, as though recovering from numbness, stretched herself as if waking up, then propping her hand against the bed, lifted her body, and with one jump was in her father's arms. Thomas's swivel eyes popped out of his head. He extended his hand and touched the girl, apparently wishing to make sure she was real. The disciples were astonished and frightened. The crowd, which had swarmed around, bellowed for an instant, and then, terrified, became immediately mute. Nothing was heard but the girl's refreshing laughter as she hugged and kissed her father. Judas approached the Master, his face angry and evil. "You dissipate your strength on unbelievers. You help our enemies. Is this the end of the world you've brought us? Are these the flames?" But Jesus, hovering far away in dark skies, did not hear him. He had been frightened more than anyone else at the sight of the girl jumping out of her bed. The disciples, unable to contain their joy, formed a circle and danced around him. So they had done well to abandon everything and join him. He was the real thing. He performed miracles. Thomas placed a scale in his mind and weighed. On one tray he put his wares, on the other the kingdom of heaven. The trays oscillated for some time and finally stood still. The kingdom of heaven was the heavier. Yes, it was an excellent risk. "I give 5. I might get 1,000. Forward, then, in God's name." He approached the Master. "Rabbi," he said, "for your precious sake, I'll portion out my wares to the poor. Please don't forget it tomorrow when the kingdom of heaven arrives. I'm sacrificing everything to come with you, for today I saw and touched the truth." But Jesus was still far away. He heard but did not answer. "I'm going to keep only my horn," continued the former merchant, "so that I can blow it to assemble the people. We're selling new wares, immortal ones, and free." The centurion, holding his daughter in his arms, came up to Jesus. "Man of God," he said, "you revived my daughter. What favor can I do for you?" "I freed your daughter from the chains of Satan," Jesus answered. "You, centurion, free those 3 rebels from the chains of Rome." Rufus bowed his head and sighed. "I cannot," he murmured, sadly. "Truly I cannot. I took an oath to the Roman emperor, just as you took an oath to the God you worship. It is right to betray our oath, is it? Ask me any other favor you desire. I'm leaving for Jerusalem the day after tomorrow, and I want to do this favor for you before I go." "Centurion," Jesus replied, "one day we shall meet in holy Jerusalem at a difficult hour. I shall ask the favor of you at that time. Until then, be patient." He placed his hand on the girl's blonde hair and kept it there for a long time. He closed his eyes, felt the warmth of the head, the softness of the hair, the sweetness of womanhood. "My child," he said at last, opening his eyes, "I am going to tell you something which I don't want you to forget. Take your father by the hand and lead him to the true road." "Which is the true road, man of God?" the girl asked. "Love." The centurion gave orders. Food and drink were brought, tables set. "Be my guest," he said to Jesus and the disciples. "Tonight you shall eat and drink in this house, for I celebrate my child's resurrection. I have not been happy for years. Today my heart is filled to overflowing with joy. Welcome." He leaned over to Jesus. "I owe a great debt of gratitude to the God you worship," he said. "Give him to me so that I can send him to Rome along with the other gods." "He will get there on his own," Jesus answered, and he went out to the yard in order to breathe. Night fell. The stars began to mount the sky. Below, in the tiny village, the lamps were lighted, and the eyes of the people gleamed. This evening, their everyday talk rose 1 degree higher than usual, for they sensed that God, like a kind lion, had entered their village. The tables were set. Jesus sat down among his disciples and divided the bread out, and did not speak. Within him, his soul still anxiously flapped its wings as though it had just escaped an immense danger or completed a great and unexpected exploit. The disciples around him did not speak either, and their hearts bounded for joy. All these ends of the world and the kingdoms of heaven were not dreams and mere excitement. They were the truth. And the dark complexioned, barefooted youth next to them, who ate, spoke, laughed, and slept like other men, was truly the apostle of God. When the meal ended, and all the others lay down to sleep, Matthew knelt below the lamp, drew out the virgin notebook from under his shirt, took his quill from behind his ear, leaned over the blank pages, and remained meditating for a long time. How should he begin? Where should he begin? God had placed him next to this holy man in order that he might faithfully record the words he said and the miracles he performed, so that they would not perish, and that future generations might learn about them and choose in their turn the road of salvation. Surely that was the duty God had entrusted to him. He knew how to read and write, therefore he had a heavy responsibility to catch with his pen all that was about to perish, and by placing it on paper to make it immortal. Let the disciples detest him. Let them not want to frequent his presence, because once he was a publican. He would show them now that the repentant sinner is better than the man who has never sinned. He plunged his quill into the bronze inkwell, and heard a rustling of wings to his right. An angel seemed to come to his ear and dictate. With a sure, rapid hand, he started to write. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham, Abraham begot. He wrote and wrote until the east began to glow bluish-white, and the first cock was heard to crow. They departed with Thomas and his horn in the lead. He sounded it, and the village awoke. "Farewell," he shouted. "See you soon in the kingdom of heaven." Jesus came from behind with the disciples and the mob of ragamuffins and cripples from Nazareth, who still followed him, augmented now by new ones from Cana. They were waiting. "He can't possibly forget us," they said to themselves. "The blessed hour will come when he'll turn toward us too and rid us of hunger and disease." Today, Judas remained at the end of the procession. He had found a set of large traveling bags, and he halted before each door and spoke to the housewives in a half-beseeching, half-threatening voice. On our side, we work for you, poor things, so you can be saved. On your side, you can help us, keep us from starving to death. You must know that even saints have to eat to get strength to save mankind. Some bread, cheese, raisins, dates, a handful of olives. No matter what it is, God writes it down and repays you in the next world. You give one split olive, and he'll repay you with a whole orchard. And if any housewife dallied in opening her larder, he shouted at her, "Why so tight-fisted, lady? Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or even tonight the heavens will open, fire will fall, and of all your goods nothing will be spared except what you give to us. If you're saved, you miserable creature, you'll owe it to the bread and olives and bottle of oil you gave me." The frightened women opened their larders, and by the time Judas reached the edge of the village, his sacks were overflowing with alms. Winter had begun. The earth shivered. Many trees, standing completely bare, were cold. Others, the olive, date, cypress, were blessed by God and retained their finery intact, summer and winter. Similarly with men. All the poor were cold like the bald trees. John had thrown his wooden robe over Jesus, and now, shivering, was in a hurry to reach Capernaum, in order to open his mother's trunks. Old Salome had woven many things in her lifetime, and her heart was noble and generous. He would portion out warm clothes to the companions, and devil care if old Lickpenny Zebedee grumbled. It was Salome, with her obstinacy and sweetness, who governed the house. Philip was hurrying too, his thoughts on his bosom friend Nathanael, hunched over, as he was all day long in Capernaum, sewing up and patching sandals and slippers. His life was being lost in this way. Where could he find time to lift his mind to God, to lean Jacob's ladder against the heavens and mount? Oh, when will I get there, Philip thought, to unveil the great secret to the poor wretch, so that he too can be saved. They took a turning, leaving Tiberias behind them on their left. Tiberias, despised by God, with its Baptist murdering tetrarch, condemned to the fires of hell. Matthew approached Peter to ask him everything he remembered about the river Jordan and the Baptists, so that he could write it all down, event by event. But Peter recoiled and turned his face aside to avoid inhaling the publican's breath. Saddened, Matthew wedged the partly filled notebook under his arm. He lagged behind, and finding two carters who went to and from Tiberias, questioned them in order to learn, and to set down in his book, how the wicked murder took place. Was it true that the tetrarch became drunk, and that his stepdaughter Salome danced before him naked? Matthew had to learn all the details in order to immortalize them in writing. They had by this time arrived at the large well outside Magdala. Clouds had covered the sun. A pale darkness fell over the face of the earth. Black threads of rain hung down, joining sky and soil. Magdalene lifted her eyes to her skylight and saw the heavens blacken. "Winter is upon us," she murmured. "I must move quickly." She twirled the bobbin and began with great speed to spin the choice wool she had found. She intended to weave a warm cloak for her beloved so that he would not be cold. From time to time she glanced toward the yard and admired her grand promenade with its burden of fruit. She was guarding the promenades, sorry, she was guarding the pomegranates and not cutting them, for she had vowed them all to Jesus. God is exceedingly merciful, she reflected. One day my beloved will again pass through this narrow street, and then I shall fill my arms with pomegranates and place them at his feet. He will bend over, take one, and refresh himself. While spinning and admiring the pomegranate tree, she turned her life over in her mind. It began and ended with Jesus, the Son of Mary. What sorrow, what joy she had had! Why had he left her, opening her door on that final night to flee like a burglar? Where had he gone? Was he still wrestling with shadows instead of digging the soil, fashioning wood or fishing the sea instead of having a wife? Women were God's creatures too, and sleeping next to her. Ah, if he would only pass once more through Magdala, so that she could run and place her pomegranates at his feet to refresh him. While she meditated on all this and rotated the bobbin with her quick, skilled hand, she heard cries and trampling in the street and the sound of the horn. Halloo! Wasn't it cross-eyed Thomas the peddler? And then she heard a shrill voice. Open! Open your doors! The kingdom of heaven is here. Magdalene jumped up, her heart leaping for joy. He had come. He had come. Cold and warm shudders passed through her entire body. Forgetting her kerchief, she rushed out, her hair flowing down to her shoulders. She went through the yard and appeared on the doorstep. Then she saw the Lord. Uttering a joyous cry, she held at his feet. Rabbi, Rabbi, she purred. Welcome. She had forgotten the pomegranates and her vow. She hugged the sacred knees, and her blue-black hair, which still smelled from its old accursed perfumes, spilled out over the ground. Rabbi, Rabbi, welcome, she purred, and she dragged him gently toward her poor house. Jesus bent over, took her by the hand, and lifted her up. Bashful and enchanted, he held her just as an inexperienced bridegroom holds his bride. His body rejoiced from its very roots. It was not Magdalene he had lifted from the ground, but the soul of man, and he was its bridegroom. Magdalene trembled, blushed, spread her hair over her bosom to hide it. Everyone looked at her with astonishment. How she had pined away, lost her color. Purple rings encircled her eyes, and her firm, full mouth had withered like an unwanted flower. As she and Jesus walked hand in hand, they felt they were dreaming. Instead of treading the earth, they were floating in the air and proceeding. Was this a wedding? Was the ragged multitude which followed behind, filling the whole street, the marriage procession? And the pomegranate tree, which was visible in the yard with its burden of fruit, was it a kind spirit, or a household goddess, or perhaps a simple, thrice fortunate woman who had given birth to sons and daughters, and now stood in the middle of her yard and admired them? Magdalene, Jesus said softly, all your sins are forgiven, for you have loved much. She leaned over, wonderfully happy. She wanted to say, "I am a virgin," but she was so overjoyed she could not open her mouth. She ran, pillaged the pomegranate tree, filled her apron, and made a tower of the cool red fruit at the beloved's feet. What happened next was precisely what she had so ardently desired. Jesus bent down, took the pomegranate, opened it, filled his hand with seeds, and refreshed his throat. Then the disciples stooped in their turn. Each took a pomegranate and refreshed himself. "Magdalene," Jesus said, "why do you look at me with such troubled eyes, as though you were saying good-bye to me?" "My beloved, I have been saying hello and good-bye to you every single instant since the day I was born." She spoke so softly that only Jesus and John, who were close to her, could hear. After a moment's silence, she continued, "I must look at you because woman issued from the body of man and still cannot detach her body from his. But you must look at heaven because you are a man, and man was created by God. Allow me to look at you, therefore, my child." She pronounced these momentous words, "my child," in such a low voice that not even Jesus heard her, but her own breast filled out and stirred as though she were giving suck to her son. A murmur arose in the crowd. New invalids suddenly arrived and occupied the entire yard. "Rabbi," said Peter, "the people are grumbling and impatient. What do they want?" "A kind word, a miracle. Look at them." Jesus turned. In the turbulent air of the squall which was coming, he perceived a multitude of half-opened mouths full of longing, and of eyes which were gazing at him with anguish. An old man came forward through the crowd. His eyelashes had fallen out. His eyes were like two wounds. Around his skeleton-like neck hung 10 amulets, each containing one of the 10 commandments. He leaned on his forked staff and stood himself in the doorway. "Rabbi," he said, his voice all grievance and pain, "I am 100 years old. Hanging around my neck constantly before me are God's 10 commandments. I have not disobeyed a single one of them. Every year I go to Jerusalem and offer a sacrificial ram to holy Sabbath. I light candles and burn sweet incense. At night, instead of sleeping, I sing psalms. I look sometimes at the stars, sometimes at the mountains, and wait. Wait for the Lord to descend so that I may see him. That is the only recompense I desire. I have waited now for years and years, but in vain. I have 1 foot in the grave, yet I still have not seen him. Why? Why? Mine is a great grievance, Rabbi. When shall I see the Lord? When shall I find peace?" As he spoke, he grew continually angrier. Soon he was banging his forked staff down on the ground and shouting. Jesus smiled. "Old man," he replied, "once upon a time there was a marble throne at the eastern gate of an important city. On this throne sat 1,000 kings blind in the right eye, 1,000 kings blind in the left eye, and 1,000 kings who had sight in both eyes. All of them called God to appear so that they might see him, but all went to their graves with their wishes unfulfilled. When the kings had died, a pauper, barefooted and hungry, came and sat on the throne. 'God,' he whispered, The eyes of man cannot bear to look directly at the sun, for they are blinded. How then, omnipotent, can they look directly at you? Have a pity, Lord. Temper your strength, turn down your splendor, so that I, who am poor and afflicted, may see you. Then listen, old man. God became a piece of bread, a cup of cool water, a warm tunic, a hut, and in front of the hut, a woman giving suck to an infant. The pauper stretched forth his arms and smiled happily. Thank you, Lord, he whispered. You humbled yourself for my sake. You became bread, water, a warm tunic, and my wife and son, in order that I might see you. And I did see you. I bow down and worship your beloved many-faced face. No one spoke. The old man sighed like a buffalo, and putting forth his forked staff, disappeared into the crowd. Next, a young man, newly married, lifted his fists and shouted, They say you hold fire to burn up the world, to burn up our homes and children. Is this the kind of love you claim to bring us? Is this the justice? Fire? Jesus' eyes filled with tears. He pitied this newly married youth. Truly, was this the justice he brought? Fire? Was there no other way to attain salvation? Tell us clearly what we have to do to be saved, cried a house owner, who then elbowed his way through the gathering in order to come close for the answer, since he was hard of hearing. Open your hearts, thundered Jesus. Open your larders, divide your belongings among the poor. The day of the Lord has come. Whoever stingily retains a loaf of bread, a jar of oil, or a strip of land for his final hours will find that bread and that jar and that earth hanging around his neck and dragging him down to hell. My ears are buzzing, said the house owner. Excuse me if I leave, but I feel dizzy. He went off in a rage toward his rich villa. Listen to that. Divide our belongings among the scabby rabble. Is this justice? Damn him to hell. Mumbling to himself and cursing, he continued on. Jesus watched him disappear. Wide is the gate of hell, he said with a sigh, wide the road and strewn with flowers. But the gate to God's kingdom is narrow, the way uphill. While we live, we may choose, for life means freedom. But when death comes, what's done is done, and there is no deliverance. If you want me to believe in you, shouted a man with crutches, perform a miracle and heal me. Shall I enter the kingdom of heaven lame? And I leprous? And I with only one arm? And I blind? The cripples moved forward in one body and stood threatening in front of him. Losing all sense of restraint, they began to shout. A blind old man lifted his staff. Cure us, he howled, or you won't leave our village alive. Peter ripped the staff out of the old man's hands. With a soul like yours, buzzard eyes, you'll never see the light. The cripples drew together and became ferocious. The disciples became ferocious in their turn and placed themselves next to Jesus. Magdalene, terrified, put out her hand to bolt the door, but Jesus stopped her. Magdalene, my sister, he said, this is an unfortunate generation, all flesh. Habits, sins, and fat crush their souls. I push away flesh, bones, and entrails to find the soul, and I find nothing. Alas, I think the only cure is fire. He turned to the multitude. His eyes were now dry and pitiless. just as we scorch the fields before sowing, in order for the good seed to thrive, so shall God scorch the earth. He has no mercy for thorns, tares, or tarragon. That is the meaning of justice. Farewell." He turned to Thomas. "Blow your horn. We're leaving." He put forth his staff. The benumbed people made way, and he passed through. Magdalene ran into her house, seized her kerchief, and, leaving the wool half spun, the earthenware pot on the mantel, and the poultry unfed in her yard, tossed the door key into the middle of the road. Then, without looking back, silent and tightly wrapped in her kerchief, she followed the Son of Mary.